Hello, my name is David Roman from Comprehensive Environmental. I am a water resources engineer and specialize in climate resiliency and adaptation. The purpose of this presentation is to discuss results from a planning grant that Groveland received to perform a resiliency assessment under Massachusetts Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. This presentation is being held remotely in light of the recent COVID-19 outbreak to limit potential transmission. Public feedback is encouraged, and contact information will be provided at the end of this presentation. This presentation will last for approximately 20 to 30 minutes, and will cover an overview of the MVP program, Groveland-specific climate change projections, a summary of planning grant results, and a discussion of next steps. The MVP program provides support for cities and towns in Massachusetts to begin the process of planning for climate change resiliency and implementing priority projects. The state awards communities with funding to complete vulnerability assessments and to develop action-oriented resiliency plans. Communities who complete the MVP program become certified as an MVP community and are therefore eligible for MVP Action Grant funding as well as other opportunities. The overall MVP program steps are to first obtain a planning grant, to complete an in-person workshop, and then at the conclusion of the workshop and upon writing a report, they then become certified by the state as an MVP community. More information about the MVP program can be found at the mass.gov website at the link provided in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. Over the last 3 years, almost 3/4 of the state has participated in the MVP program. Total funding for the program has been approximately $17 million to date. The most recent Action Grant application round, which was held in the fall of 2019, ended up funding over 54 projects throughout the state for a total of more than $10 million. So there is some serious money involved in this to be able to implement these recommendations that come out of this program. The MVP program funds many project types designed to increase resiliency relative to potential climate change impacts. So I won't go into all of these, but the most common types of projects so far have been performance of more detailed vulnerability assessments, redesigns and retrofits of existing infrastructure, and nature-based solutions for flood protection, drought mitigation, and water quality improvements. There are a number of other eligible project types, and one example is that the program was expanded in 2019 to include energy resiliency projects. And this could include items such as implementation of solar panels on the roofs of public buildings to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We will now discuss some climate projections that drive the MVP program. Over the last 50 to 100 years, Massachusetts' climate has been changing. We have seen increases in temperature and associated growing season, increases in sea level, and heavy rainfall events, as well as snow. One example is that the average temperature across the state has increased by almost 3 degrees Fahrenheit since 1895. Climate projections across the state have been compiled as part of the MVP program, and these projections are available at resilientma.org, and this is a great website that provides interactive interactive tools that enable data exploration. So based on the projections from resilientma.org, it is expected that average temperature and rainfall could continue to significantly increase in Essex County. These numbers on the screen here are based on median projections. So there's kind of the lower projections, the median, and the higher projections. So based on this, the average temperature in Essex County is expected to increase from 50 degrees Fahrenheit in 2020 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit in 2100. That's an increase of almost 10 degrees Fahrenheit over the course of just 80 years. So a big expected change. So to put this average temperature into perspective, the following plot depicts average Massachusetts temperature relative to various climate change scenarios. So this includes the worst case conditions, which would be a higher emission scenario, as well as best case conditions, or under the lower emission scenario. So under worst case conditions, the average temperature of Massachusetts could mirror that of the Charlotte, North Carolina region by the year 2100. So this is a pretty compelling figure that shows what some of the impacts of increases in temperature can result in. The potential consequences of climate change are widespread. These could include increases in flooding, increases in invasive pests, which we've seen just this past summer with a bunch more ticks, as well as mosquito issues. And then, of course, just more frequent extreme weather events. And there are other potential consequences as well. So one key piece of the town's MVP planning grant was to hold an all-day workshop. And the goal of this workshop was to have community stakeholders work collaboratively to complete a climate change and natural hazard vulnerability assessment to develop prioritized actions to address vulnerabilities and improve strengths. So this workshop was based on the Community Resiliency Building Program, and more information on this can be found at the link at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen at communityresiliencebuilding.com. So the workshop was broken up, the all-day workshop was broken up into 3 primary in-person exercises. So the whole point of the workshop was to be very interactive and allow stakeholders, to be involved in the process. So the exercises were to identify top hazards, identify concerns and strengths, and to identify actions to address these concerns. So an interdisciplinary team of town staff worked to implement the CRB process and were supported by Comprehensive Environmental Inc., which is a certified MVP provider. A risk matrix, as shown on the screen here, was used to facilitate these in-person exercises. And we'll go into this risk matrix in a lot more detail in the subsequent slides. Groveland's MVP workshop was held on December 5th, 2019, which is a couple months ago. So the date today is March 17th. And the workshop was attended by 10 stakeholders and coordinated by Rebecca Oldham, the town planner. So attendees, which are shown on the left-hand side of the screen, were split into 2 groups, and each group was responsible for completing a risk matrix. And each group was facilitated by staff from Comprehensive Environmental. The first exercise of the workshop was to identify top hazards. in town. And based on potential future experience, based on past and potential future experiences, the town selected flooding, strong storms, and extreme temperatures as their top three hazards. And it should also be noted that strong storms can include a variety of different items, including wind, thunderstorms, ice storms, snowstorms, and others. So it kind of covers the full gambit of potential storms. As an example, this image on the screen is a completed risk matrix that was filled out during the workshop by one of the workshop groups. And following the workshop, the risk matrix was formalized and typed up. So there are a couple different components within this risk matrix that each group used to complete the 3 in-person exercises of the workshop. So as an overall group, workshop participants first identified Groveland's top 3 hazards. And this was the first exercise. The second exercise was to identify concerns and strengths within town relative to these hazards. And concerns were based on 3 different general categories, including infrastructure, and this includes items such as buildings, roads, stormwater pipes, dams, societal, and societal is, really based on community type issues. So think of emergency response, isolation of potential areas during a flooding event, and emergency sheltering. The third category is environmental, and this category is really more for potential environmental impacts to climate change, such as existing habitat, water quality, and other items like that. So once the top hazards and concerns and strengths were identified, the last exercise was to identify potential actions that could be implemented to reinforce strengths and address concerns. And each group ranked these actions based on a scale of high, medium, or low, and identified that these actions should be a short-term action, a long-term action, or an ongoing action. Now, the final exercise of the workshop, once the risk matrix was completed, was for the overall group to vote on the top 3 actions for future implementation. So, the results of the workshop are, so we will now go over the results from the workshop. So the first items are to go over the top infrastructural concerns. And the first item here is stormwater infrastructure. And this was a pretty big concern. There are a number of undersized aging pipes and culverts within town. And there are some areas of known historical flooding. And a lot of that flooding could result from these undersized pipes or culverts. So one known area is Johnson Creek. Basically this is the overall Johnson Creek watershed area. There are also a couple of significant hazard dams also located within the Johnson Creek watershed that don't have formalized operation management strategies. The town water supply, there are a couple of water supply wells as well as the pump stations that are located within close proximity to the Merrimack River and are within the 100-year floodplain. So it's possible that if there were a big storm that the equipment, could be offline. And there's also just some general water quality issues associated with some of the town water supply wells, including iron and manganese. Another concern is the town sewer system. So about half of the town is actually on septic systems, and septic can lead to potential water quality issues, especially in areas that are already prone to flooding. So the top societal concerns are listed here, and this includes hazard mitigation planning. So the town already has a regional hazard mitigation plan conducted by the Merrimack Planning Commission, and the idea here is to take that regional plan and turn it into a town-specific hazard mitigation plan. There are also a number of vulnerable communities within town. In particular, senior living facilities were identified that could pose potential evacuation challenges without individualized response plans. And the Bagnall School is currently used for emergency sheltering. And there was some concern that the school might need more capacity as well as amenities to handle a large influx of citizens from a possible hazard event, such as a flood. Top environmental concerns include forest management. So there have been some historical brush fires in conservation areas in town. We've all seen the overall increase in invasive pests, including mosquitoes and ticks. And there is a reoccurrence of nuisance flooding just from the ongoing construction of beaver dams within these forested areas. The town of Groveland has a fair amount of conserved land, and there is also ongoing development. So the concern here is to make sure that existing undeveloped land is protected in order to maintain flood storage and overall biodiversity. Groveland does have a number of strengths that were identified during the workshop. These include emergency services. So there's an excellent response track record during events. The town has 1,600 acres of conservation land or open space, which is a very significant portion of town. The town also has, town-operated electrical distribution system, which leads to generally higher response rates than other regional operators who are required to respond on a much wider scale. So this is seen as a strength. The town is able to kind of manage their own electrical system. So the top three actions that were voted on by stakeholders at the workshop are listed here. So the first item is management of Johnson Creek floodplain. So there are a couple of high hazard dams located at the outlet of Johnson's Pond as well as Lower Pond, and there's currently no formalized floodplain management strategies to operate these dams. So the recommended solution was to develop a management plan, including implementation of decision support to, basically for increased resiliency of these dams. So, one example would be that some monitoring equipment could be installed, and then the outlets of these dams could be configured such that releases could be made before a storm happens, to kind of minimize the potential that the spillway has to be used, causing wider downstream flooding. Another recommended action, or the second recommended action, was to perform a town-wide vulnerability and resiliency assessment. And as we had stated, the town's current hazard mitigation plan was done on a regional scale by the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission, and there are currently no town-specific actions within that plan that also have potential costs associated with it. So it would be very helpful for the town to have a capital improvement plan type structure for these recommendations so that they can prioritize and plan out, into future years for how to implement these recommendations to increase resiliency. So, the overall goal here is to take the current hazard mitigation plan and make this into a more detailed town-specific assessment that includes prioritized actions. The other advantage of this is that in addition to MVP action grant funding, if you have an approved hazard mitigation plan, that also opens the door for funding through FEMA. And FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. The third recommended action was to perform a town-wide stormwater system vulnerability assessment. So there are a number of aging and undersized pipes in town, and then other flood issues as well. So the image on the top right of the screen is showing, you can just barely see it, but this is an outfall that leads into the Merrimack River. You can see that there's a decent amount of scour occurring or erosion at the mouth of that outfall. So the recommended action here is to perform a town-wide assessment of the stormwater system, which can include components such as condition assessments, flood modeling of key areas like the Johnson Creek watershed, and come up with prioritized recommendations for integration into a capital improvement plan. So this recommendation really ties closely to the previous recommendation of coming up with a town-wide vulnerability and resiliency assessment. So these recommendations could be paired together. There were a number of other high priority actions that were identified during the workshop, including identifying the Johnson Creek Culvert at Center Street, developing a plan to improve emergency shelter capacity at the Bagnell School, developing just a more formalized emergency response notification tree that takes into account all town departments, a feasibility study for potential sewer expansion to mitigate potential water quality impacts from septic systems, and then just general outreach that could be used to improve resiliency against insect-borne illnesses, such as from mosquitoes. So the next steps here are, right now this presentation is the listening session. So upon completing this listening session, Groveland will receive MVP community designation and will be eligible to apply for action grant funding through the MVP program. So the next steps are to brainstorm ideas and submit a competitive grant for consideration in the action grant funding program. So submissions are expected to be due probably in May or June of this year. So it's coming up right around the corner. So thank you for listening to this presentation. I just want to mention that a copy of the final report, as well as this presentation, can be found on the Planning Department website. And feel free, and it's encouraged, by the way, to please reach out to either of the contacts below to provide feedback on this presentation or the final report. And again, my name is David Roman from Comprehensive Environmental, so you can certainly reach out to me, or you can reach out to Rebecca Oldham, the town planner. If we receive any feedback, we will take that feedback and compile it and then include it as an appendix in the final report. So thank you for listening, and have a great day.